Okay, so everyone's talking about abortion and immigration these days, right? Like, where do we even stand as a country? It's not just like a casual debate anymore. It feels like everything's on fire.
Right. It's like this constant tension.
But lucky for you, we're diving deep today, and we've got this America at a Crossroads podcast episode to help us sort through it all. We're going to break down both sides, like, what are their arguments really? And then, like, how's this actually playing out in different parts of the country? And who knows, maybe we'll even find like a little bit of common ground along the way.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how these two topics kind of force us to think about, like, what does it even mean to be an American right now in the 21st century? What do we owe each other? Where do, like, my freedoms end and, like, the good of everyone else begin?
You hit the nail on the head there. And maybe the biggest elephant in the room right now is abortion. I mean, after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022, it's like we went back in time. States are making up their own rules now. Some are all about protecting access. Others are basically banning it completely.
It's huge. It's like a legal and ethical earthquake. And the aftershocks are hitting women's healthcare, economic equality, even like the very definition of when life begins. It's all happening right now.
Yeah, and in the podcast we hear from Sarah. She's a pro-choice activist, and she makes this really compelling argument about personal freedom. Like, women should have the right to make choices about their own bodies without the government butting in. She's especially concerned about how these restrictive laws are hitting low-income women and minorities the hardest. If they can't afford to travel to a state where abortion is legal, are they going to be forced into dangerous situations? It's scary to think about.
Her argument totally connects to like this bigger fight for reproductive rights and justice that's been going on for decades, right?
Right.
It really raises the question, like, even if abortion is technically legal, is it actually accessible for every woman who needs it?
Then we hear from Mark, who's a pro-life advocate, and he's coming from this place of believing that life starts at conception. So for him, abortion is morally the same as taking a human life. It's a really powerful argument that I think a lot of people connect with on a deep level.
Right. And Mark's whole view is built on this idea of fetal personhood, which is this complex philosophical concept that's been super central to the pro-life movement. He even talks about other options like adoption and more support for women who have unplanned pregnancies. It's not just about being against abortion for him. It's about offering what he sees as a better way.
So is there like any middle ground in this debate?
Mhm.
Because it feels so polarized. The podcast kind of suggests that maybe we could focus on preventing unwanted pregnancies in the first place. Like, what if we had better sex education and wider access to contraception? Then maybe the abortion debate wouldn't be so intense.
It's definitely a more proactive approach, and it could potentially reduce the need for abortions, which addresses some concerns from both sides, right?
All right, so let's shift gears to immigration, which is like another one of those supercharged issues. I mean, America prides itself on being this nation of immigrants, a melting pot of cultures. But at the same time, we're still fighting over who gets to be called an American.
It's crazy, right? History shows us that, like, every single wave of new immigrants has faced suspicion and resistance. They even played these audio clips in the podcast from, like, anti-Irish and anti-Italian movements from back in the 1800s. And it's shocking how similar it sounds to stuff we hear today. It's like this fear of the other is baked into our DNA as a nation.
It's true. In the podcast, we hear from Maria. She's an immigrant rights advocate, and she just paints this really powerful picture of immigrants as like the backbone of our country. They're entrepreneurs, artists, doctors. They enrich our society in so many ways. And she's calling for more humane immigration laws, especially for people seeking asylum who are literally fleeing violence and persecution.
Yeah, and she makes this really important distinction that often gets lost in the debate, which is the difference between legal and illegal immigration. Like the asylum process, for example, it's incredibly complex and can take years. So a lot of people end up risking these dangerous journeys because they feel like it's their only shot at a better life.
Then we have John, who's a former Border Patrol officer. And while he says he supports legal immigration, his main focus is on border security. He talks about the strain that illegal immigration puts on our social services. The potential security risks the need for strong enforcement. He even tells this story about a woman who was trafficked across the border, which is just heartbreaking. It highlights the human cost of what happens when things go unchecked.
John brings up some really valid concerns about illegal immigration, like the potential for exploitation and crime and the need to protect our borders. But we also have to acknowledge that, like, the rhetoric around immigration is often blown way out of proportion and dehumanizing. Immigrants are often blamed for bigger problems in society that they have nothing to do with.
So it's like, how do we reconcile these two sides? They seem so opposite. Is there any way to balance compassion with security? The podcast has this interesting idea, which is, what if we strengthen border security, but at the same time, make it easier for people to immigrate legally?
Right. Like imagine a system where people can come here, contribute their skills, and build a life without being constantly afraid. And at the same time, we're focusing resources on stopping the dangerous stuff, not punishing people who are just looking for a better life.
Hmm.
It would require a huge shift in our political landscape, but it feels like a potential path towards something better.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. And this is just the beginning. Abortion and immigration are both so complex. But thanks to you, I feel like I'm starting to grasp the nuances.
We're just getting started. Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's really dig into like the history and the societal forces that are shaping all of this.
So we've kind of laid out the battle lines on these two issues, abortion and immigration.
Yeah.
But I'm feeling like there's something deeper going on here. Like, what's the connection between these two things? They seem so different.
You know what it might be? It might be power.
Power.
Yeah, like who has it? Who doesn't? And how does that like shape the whole conversation? You know what I mean?
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
Well, let's take abortion rights. For example, it really comes down to like who gets to decide what happens to a woman's body? Is it the woman herself? Or is it the government? That's like a huge power struggle, right?
Yeah.
And it has consequences way beyond just reproductive health.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And it's kind of the same with immigration too, right? It's about who gets to decide who belongs in this country, who gets to benefit from all the good stuff we have here. Is it a right, a privilege, a threat? Whoever's in power gets to control that narrative.
Exactly. And that's why these debates are so intense, because they're not just theoretical. They're affecting real people's lives, their jobs, their futures. It's serious stuff.
And the future of our country too.
Yeah.
The people in power are the ones who decide where we're headed.
100%. And that's why it's so important to understand the past. History can give us some context, help us see how we got to this point. Like take abortion rights, for example. Roe v. Wade was this huge victory, but it was always under attack. People who opposed abortion, they kept chipping away at it for decades. And eventually they succeeded in overturning it.
Wow, that historical perspective makes the situation even more intense. Progress isn't always a straight line, huh? It can go backwards too.
Exactly. And that's why we can't ever take progress for granted. You always have to keep fighting for what you believe in, even when things look bleak.
So what about the history of immigration in America? It seems like we've been having the same arguments for over a century now.
Remember those audio clips from the podcast? The anti-immigrant stuff they were saying back in the 1800s about the Irish and Italians? It's crazy how much it sounds like what people say today. It's like we're stuck in this loop.
Yeah, John, the former Border Patrol officer in the podcast, he even talking about how those old arguments connect to his own experience. He was all about the need for secure borders and the potential dangers of uncontrolled immigration.
And I get it. Those concerns aren't completely out there. But we can't forget that immigrants have always been scapegoated. Whenever something goes wrong in society, the economy tanks, or there's a spike in crime, immigrants are often the first ones to get blamed. It's an easy way to deflect responsibility and manipulate people.
So it's like a pattern throughout history that we need to be aware of. If we can understand that, then maybe we can start having more honest conversations about immigration.
Totally. History can help us build empathy, too. When we learn about the struggles and triumphs of the people who came before us, we can start to see these issues in a whole new light. We start to understand the human cost of our policies.
So if we're trying to find some common ground on these issues, it sounds like history can be a really important tool.
It can be a bridge, By acknowledging our shared past, the good and the bad, we can start to see each other as human beings and build a more inclusive future.
It feels like both abortion and immigration are forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our past and our present. Truths that challenge our assumptions and make us really think about our values.
I agree. And those truths can be tough to swallow, but if we want to move forward in a good way, we have to face them head on.
Okay, so we've talked about power and history. What are some other big themes that are coming up in these debates?
One that really stands out to me is this tension between individual rights and the responsibility we have to each other as a society. It's like this delicate balancing act that's at the heart of so many political debates.
I'm not sure I follow you. Could you give me an example?
Sure. Think about abortion. On the one hand, you have a woman's right to make her own choices about her body and her health. But on the other hand, there's this question of whether society has an interest in protecting potential life.